Imagine there's a knock on your door, and you open it and find the police standing there. They've come to arrest you on charges of witchcraft. You're shocked, appalled. Where has this come from? When they take you down to jail and begin your interrogation, you discover that your neighbor has accused you. Apparently, her petunias have all wilted and her cat disappeared under suspicious circumstances. She's quite sure that you and your bad magic are to blame. Now you know what's going to come next. They're going to begin asking you questions about when you cast these spells, which demon you are in league with, how often you've worshipped at a witch's Sabbath, and so on. And you're going to be encouraged very strongly to confess. You're going to be encouraged through the use of torture. They might start with a bit of beating. They might move on to mechanical devices like thumb screws or tying you up in stress positions for hours, depriving you of sleep, applying a vice to your legs. They're going to cause you excruciating levels of agony until you produce a confession. You're going to have to supply details of exactly when, where, and with whom you did these evil things. It's a terrible situation because if you don't confess, the torture is going to continue and you're going to be executed. If you do confess, the torture will stop and you may just be stuck in jail for a while. Of course, there's going to be social ostracization and the risk that you'll be dragged back into jail again on future charges of witchcraft, having been convicted once already. But the sickening twist is that you're also going to have to supply names. When you confess to make the torture stop, you're going to have to tell your interrogators who else in the village you have been doing evil things with and worshiping the devil with. And you know that when you supply those names, every single one of those people is going to be faced with the same horrific experience that you yourself are enduring. This is not fiction. These are the actual circumstances that people accused of witchcraft actually faced. And today we're going to talk about people in this situation in America, in a small town called Salem, in New England, near Massachusetts, in about the year 1691-1692. This is the third episode of Villains and Virgins, and we are talking about witchcraft on the continent and the New World. Things begin to get strange in Salem Village in January 1692. Two young girls, aged 9 and 11, living in the house of Minister Samuel Parris, begin to experience bizarre symptoms. They're twitching, screaming, shrieking, and they claim that they're being pinched, jabbed, and otherwise tormented by invisible hands. Now, because this happened in the house of a minister, the first response was fasting and prayer for several days. So, in many Christian traditions, fasting or abstaining from food for a period of several days or several meals is undertaken in situations of distress. It's used to add an extra emphasis to the prayers that are sent up over whatever circumstance a person is facing. So Minister Samuel Parris begins fasting and praying. He holds meetings in his house where other members of the church can come to also fast and pray to help the situation with the two girls. When the village doctor arrives, he examines them, asks them some questions. He's unable to identify an illness, and so he pronounces them victims of bewitchment or witchcraft. This means that some invisible evil force is responsible for the pain and violent symptoms that the girls seem to be experiencing. Now, this sort of a thing wasn't unheard of in the New World in the late 1600s. In fact, there had been several other books printed in the previous 2 or 3 decades about isolated cases of bewitchment or witchcraft that had been occurring in the colonies. So this was a sort of a known phenomenon. People had heard about it. And also, when a doctor who hadn't had a lot of medical training anyway was unable to come up with a firm diagnosis, it was something that you could say so that you had an answer to the situation. Now, there was fasting and praying going on. There was knowledge of witchcraft as sort of a phenomenon, but there was also knowledge of sort of folk cures and remedies that people might undertake to protect against witchcraft. So one of the women who was a member of the church and had been coming to the prayer meetings at Minister Paris's house decided to try one of these folk remedies. She told the minister's slave woman, a woman called Tituba, to bake a witch cake in order to protect the girls from this evil magic. And a witch cake is really something quite bizarre. Basically, Tituba was instructed to take rye flour or rye meal and to take urine from the two children, mix it together, bake this cake, and feed it to the family dog. At this point, the identity of the witch was going to be revealed. So they did this bizarre thing, sort of on the sly, because Minister Paris would definitely not have approved of these kind of folk methods for dealing with the dark arts. But what happened was after the dog ate the witch cake, the girls began to accuse Tituba, the slave woman in their father's house, of being the cause of their torment. So who are these girls? There's 9-year-old Elizabeth Paris, who's the daughter of the minister, and 11-year-old Abigail Paris, who's the niece of the minister. Some legends say, or some versions of the story say, that the girls had been playing some sort of a fortune-telling game prior to experiencing these strange symptoms. There was a game that some girls played which involved dropping egg whites into water and looking at what shape the albumin might make, and that shape being some method of divining or foretelling something in the future. So these stories have it that one of the girls saw a coffin and began to have some sort of a hysterical reaction, which might explain the shrieking and the spasming and the otherwise hysterical behavior that the girls seem to demonstrate. Other historians argue that there really isn't any good evidence that these girls were doing that sort of an activity. But if they were, they would have been doing it very much in secret. Because if your father is a Puritan minister, particularly one as rigidly wedded to orthodoxy as Minister Paris was, this would get you in a lot of trouble. So, whatever the girls were doing, they begin to have these hysterics. Then there's this bizarre witch cake that's fed to the dog by the slave woman at the instruction of a church member. And then the girls begin to accuse Tituba, the slave woman, in the minister's house of being the cause of their torment. This is also kind of a bizarre twist. So let's take a minute and look at who this Tituba woman is, because she's a fascinating figure. If you've seen the film The Crucible, which is based on the Salem witch trials, the black slave woman in that story is Tituba. So Henry Miller, in the play that he wrote about this episode, which was made into the movie The Crucible, cast the slave woman as a black African. However, the historical record on this is far more complicated. In fact, according to sources written at the time, she was referred to both as black and as Indian. And there's fairly good evidence to suggest that she might have been an Indian, possibly a Carib Indian or indigenous woman, who had been sold into slavery in the Caribbean or Barbados and purchased there by Samuel Paris before he took his job as a minister and settled in Salem Village. The fact is that Puritan sources at the time don't really make the kind of ethnic distinctions that we are comfortable with today. For them, all that was really necessary to know is that she wasn't white. She was a colored woman. So whether you called her Indian or black, it was more or less the same thing. She was a racial outsider. She wasn't someone who was considered a member of the church, a member of the right religion, or someone who could be considered an equal in any way. She was a member of the underclass. One other interesting twist is that she was married to a man who also lived in the minister's house as a slave, who is referred to in the sources as John Indian. So it's possible that the reason she's referred to as an Indian is that this was in fact her husband's identity and was transferred to her. But she's a very interesting figure because there are elements of different racial identities, and she might even have been mixed. In any case, Tituba is now bears the brunt of these accusations, and she's not the only one. There are two other women that the 9 and 11-year-old girl in this story begin to accuse. But let's back up for a moment. As the girls begin to accuse Tituba, the minister is asking what's going on, and the story of the witch cake comes out, which Tituba had made and fed to the dog at the instruction of a woman from the church. So Minister Paris is outraged by this. He thinks that the female church member has done a terrible thing by using these folk practices, and in fact he requires her to make a formal public apology in front of the entire church congregation for the error of her ways. But she's a white woman who's a church member. Now Tituba is not so fortunate. Tituba, instead, suffers quite a severe beating at the hands of the minister, because once she's accused of this, he's going to beat a confession out of her, and he succeeds. Tituba confesses colorfully and vividly to all the questions that are asked, and these are questions that are very similar to the ones that we covered in the last episode. Things like, when did you sign a pact with the devil? How often did you attend the witch's Sabbath? How long have you been a witch? What methods did you use to torment these children? And so on. So again, the questions were not, are you a witch? The questions were, give us details of your evil practice. Tituba is a woman who's really in a difficult situation. She has nowhere to go. This person, the minister who's her master, has an enormous amount of power over her, and so she decides to confess. It turns out that Tituba is an excellent storyteller, and so her confession is going to be central to the way this witch terror begins to unfold in Salem. Now, in addition to accusing Tituba, the slave woman, in the minister's house, these two young girls accused two other women from the community who were not slaves and they were not servants. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne are also accused of witchcraft. Now, at the time that the children make these accusations, no formal action is yet taken against these other two white women. And the reason for that is that these children were considered too young to give testimony in court. So this is in January of 1692. So by late February, even the village doctor's 17-year-old maid is experiencing these strange symptoms of bewitchment. And when she gives her testimony accusing the same women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, the slave woman, now official action can be taken. So these three women are taken into custody, and very strangely, the local magistrates decide to have their hearing in a public meeting house. It was initially going to be a pub, actually, but that became so overcrowded that they moved it to a larger hall. And here, something like a very farcical court hearing takes place. The women, one by one, beginning with Tituba, are brought up onto the witness stand. The magistrates ask them questions, but the young girls, who are their accusers, the 9-year-old, the 11-year-old, the 17-year-old maid, and one other young girl, are standing right there facing the women that they are accusing. And the young girls doing the accusations begin to display an incredibly dramatic response to the verbal responses that the accused women are making. So when Sarah Good is asked, when has she tormented them? The young girls immediately throw themselves into fits, and they twitch and they scream, and they swear that she's even at that moment tormenting them to keep them from speaking. And so in front of the packed meeting house of all these people who've gathered to watch, there's this bizarre sort of theater happening where the accused woman is standing up there faced with what is taken to be evidence in real time in front of a large audience of their malign and invisible powers. So the next logical question is, why were these women singled out? And why were they dragged in on charges of witchcraft? Tituba is relatively easy to explain. As a slave woman, as a colored woman, she was an outsider. She would already have been suspected of being closer to the devil and closer to savagery by the Puritans, who really had a very rigid idea about proper belief that was closely attached to whiteness as well. So Tituba is not so hard to understand. But why Sarah Good and why Sarah Osborne? So Sarah Good was something of an outcast in Salem already. She was unliked and unlikable. She'd been the daughter of an innkeeper and, for a variety of reasons, had not been able to inherit her father's money. She married an indentured servant and so was already sort of in debt because she shared her husband's term of service. Her husband didn't survive his term of service. Sarah married again, and she and her new husband struggled because they were still responsible for some of the existing financial debts and so on that her first husband had incurred, and they also had 2 small children. So they were unable to own any property of their own. They had to live by renting rooms in the houses of other people, and apparently Sarah herself wasn't well liked. The records show that even people who were trying to help her reported she had a sharp tongue, so she was already someone that was a target for hostility and dislike, someone that people would have enjoyed getting rid of, really. Now, Sarah takes the stand, and her own husband gives testimony against her, as does her 5-year-old child, a little girl named Dorcas. You have to ask what kind of pressure there would have to be for people in her immediate family to be up there giving testimony against a wife, against a mother. And there was overwhelming social pressure in the following way. If you were related to a witch, then the suspicion that you yourself might be involved in nefarious dealings with the devil was very strong. And so in order to prevent themselves from being the next accused on the witness stand, the husband and little girl of Sarah Good were under pressure to accuse her in order to absolve themselves of blame. It's hard even to imagine standing in the witness box in the shoes of Sarah Good. Her own husband is dragged up in front of the crowd of people in the village where they live and says, quote, "It was her bad carriage to me, and indeed say I with tears that she is enemy to all that is good." So he's basically saying, she's been a terrible woman, she's been terrible to me, and I think that she's an enemy of everything that is right and good. To have one's husband and the father of one's children say this about you in public to a crowd of people who hate you and want to be rid of you must have been devastating. And then to watch her 5-year-old daughter have to come up and say things that were accusatory to her as well. There must have felt like absolutely no escape for Sarah. Everyone in the village already hated her, and now the people who were nearest to her and whom she loved the most were publicly condemning her. Sarah's story is a tragedy in many ways. Even though her husband and child publicly accuse her, it doesn't save them from the long shadow of the paranoia that is coming. In fact, only weeks later, 5-year-old Dorcas, the daughter of Sarah Good, is also accused by these other girls of being a witch. And that 5-year-old little girl is thrown into prison alongside her mother, where she eventually dies. In jail. Undoubtedly, in addition to the drama provided by the young women who were throwing themselves into fits and shrieking and trembling and shaking at the testimony given by the accused witches, the other person who provided the most drama was Tituba herself, the accused slave woman, who gave very colorful stories about her interactions with the devil. Apparently, he was a man who wore a dark hat. He had a book which she described in detail that she had signed. She had seen other names in the book. And she said, in fact, that there were many other witches. There was a large network of witches in the area who were serving the devil. And this, perhaps more than anything else, touched the vein of panic. Because if Tituba was giving such convincing and dramatic detail about this hidden network of servants of Satan and the dark underworld, and she was saying that there were many other people, where could they be? And how could they find these evil women and some men who were serving the devil and trying to destroy the community? So it's with this sense of panic that the initial trial in the Salem Meeting House closes, and there's an urgency towards finding all the other witches who haven't necessarily been named, but we need to identify them, we need to name them, and we need to stop them. And so this is what begins to happen next. After this initial hearing in the meeting house, the three women, Sarah Osborne, Sarah Good, and Tituba, are thrown into jail. And they're going to be awaiting sentencing later. The reason why there's a delay is that the village, and indeed Salem itself in the area, is lacking a royal governor. They've recently gotten rid of the previous one. They thought he was too tyrannical. And they're waiting for the arrival of a new governor who's going to be able to do things like appoint people to hand down sentences and enforce law and order. So for the moment, the first three women accused of witchcraft are thrown into jail. And a number of other accusations are also made. So the speed of this witch fear begins to pick up. As the need to find and stop other witches becomes more urgent, the girls who are making these accusations begin to name other names. And this process of accusation becomes increasingly bizarre. So just imagine an 11-year-old girl or a 17-year-old girl claiming that as they slept, they saw the specter or the ghostly apparition of some woman from the community appear to them. And sometimes these specters introduced themselves and helpfully supplied their names. This was the case presumably of one woman accused of witchcraft. Her name was Susanna Martin, and she didn't even live in Salem Village. She was a woman who lived in Amesbury, which was some ways away, but apparently had a not so good reputation. So some of the girls in Salem Village, we're talking about very young girls, they're all under 18, say that this Susanna has appeared to them and has told them her name and is responsible for tormenting them, pinching them, bruising them, and otherwise causing them pain. Now, when Susanna is dragged in and she's charged with witchcraft, these girls don't even recognize her because they have never seen her before. And when they're questioned, how did you know it was Susanna if you hadn't seen her face? They said, well, her specter told us her name. So this whole idea of spectral evidence being used to convict people of witchcraft is really difficult because it's unassailable. How can you examine that? How can you verify anything? And the stories would often change. Not everyone was on board with it. There were some members of the community in New England who were very concerned about the use of spectral evidence. A quite eminent minister, not from Salem Village, but from the neighboring area, named Increase Mather, was very concerned that courts admitting spectral evidence in witch trials was going to lead to convictions of many innocent people. But he wasn't in a position to intervene in the following way. Increase Mather, being a prominent member of the New England community, had actually gone on a ship back to England to bring back the new British governor who was going to be in charge of law and order. When that governor arrived and was aware that there was an increasing number of people who'd been thrown into jail in the previous months, he decided something had to be done. So the new governor arrives in May. The initial witch accusations begin in January. And so from January through May, there's an increasing number of people who've been accused of witchcraft, and they've been sort of examined, sometimes publicly questioned, charged with witchcraft, and thrown into jail. In all, throughout the Salem witch crisis, 200 people are accused of being witches. Most of them are women, but there are definitely some prominent men who also end up in jail on this charge. So when the governor arrives, there aren't quite 200 yet, but the numbers are climbing. So the governor appoints two courts, which are called Oyer and Terminer, in other words, to hear and to decide, to basically deal with this growing or exploding problem of witchcraft. As soon as he sets up these courts, the governor then leaves Salem area because he has to go deal with another violent conflict with local Indian tribes. So he's got soldiers to worry about and fortresses to defend, and he leaves, having appointed a couple of judges to oversee the formal trials and sentences through these two courts. While Increase Mather, the minister who'd been involved in bringing back this governor, was very concerned about the use of spectral evidence, with the governor out of town, there was no higher authority he could appeal to rein in the judges of these two courts and their willingness to use just about any account from these girls as evidence against people accused. Now, there are too many people accused of witchcraft in Salem for me to discuss all of their stories. So I've picked a few of them to illustrate the hysteria and the growing nature of the accusations. One of the women accused by these girls was a woman named Martha Corey. And she's very interesting because unlike some of the others, she was not an outcast. She was not a marginal member of the community. In fact, she had recently become a full member of Minister Samuel Parris's Puritan Covenant congregation. So she had the marks of respectability. She was married to an older man named Giles Corey, and apparently, at some point in her distant past, a couple of decades earlier, she had done something scandalous. She'd had an illegitimate mulatto child. So this, in a small town, would have marked her as a woman who'd had a very public moral failing. To have a child with someone who was black and someone that you had no formal relationship with was taken as a sign of great immorality. Now, apparently she managed to overcome it and become a member of the church, but some people hadn't forgotten this particular aspect of her past. But why would she suddenly be targeted for witchcraft? Well, it seems that Martha Corey had been publicly skeptical about the credibility of these girls who were leveling accusations of witchcraft right, left, and center. In fact, she had apparently discouraged her husband from going to one of the first witch accusation hearings. Now, if you think about this, the girls who are doing the accusations here are enjoying a unique and unprecedented level of importance. For a girl in a Puritan community, you were basically expected to be seen and not heard. You were very low down the social hierarchy. Remember, only men were voting anyway. Women who were married and church members could achieve a certain degree of status, mainly by their connection to the church and to the men in their lives. But for an underage girl, there was really no status and no standing that you had at all. You had no voice. So there's definitely a sense that the young girls involved here, and remember how young some of them are, 9, 11, 17, are beginning to enjoy the level of attention and power that they obtain by being the center of these accusations. And suddenly the entire village is gathered in meeting houses to hear them speak. In fact, some of these girls actually went to church and had some of their fits right there in church and actually called out and mocked some of the things that the minister said from the pulpit. That would have been scandalous, utterly unheard of. And the only way that a young girl could get away with that conduct is by basically blaming it on demonic possession or on being in the power of some external evil force. So, these girls would have found it very threatening to hear about any members of the community who had been heard to question their credibility or to cast doubt on the role that they had sort of invented for themselves. And Martha Corey made the mistake of doing this. She discouraged her husband from going to one of the trials. She apparently hid his saddle to try and prevent him from getting on his horse and going over there. And it being a small village, people talked. Servants in the house, neighbors would repeat things that they had said. Gossip traveled very quickly. And so word got around to some of the girls who were doing the accusations that Martha Corey didn't think they were very credible. So very quickly, Martha Corey appeared in some of the spectral visitations that these girls were experiencing and was accused of tormenting them and being a witch. Now, Martha thought that her status as a full member of the church would protect her from these things. And at first, she didn't take the accusations very seriously. But shortly afterwards, she was dragged in, formally accused, and thrown into jail, waiting for the actual sentencing courts to come into power. So the first sentences are handed down in June, and Martha Corey and several men are hanged for being witches. Martha Corey had protested her innocence until the end, which is one reason why she was executed. Now, this is different from the way witches were dealt with on the continent, and we covered some of this in our last episode, where there were dunkings and burnings and torture houses that were set up to extract confessions. In this case, if a witch did not confess, then they were liable to be simply executed by hanging. But that's not to say that torture doesn't come into our story. It certainly does. But the infrastructure and sort of the handy tools that we see at work on the continent were somewhat missing. So the types of torture and pressure that were used were a little bit more rudimentary. In a pattern that we see again and again in the Salem witch craze, people who were related to others who'd already been accused of witchcraft were themselves far more likely to be accused next. And we see this happening to Giles Corey, the somewhat older husband of Martha Corey, who has already been hanged. So Giles Corey is accused of witchcraft, and he's brought in to the court to see the judges, and he refuses to enter any plea at all. Now, this is very interesting, because if you pleaded innocent, you were liable to be executed. And if you pleaded guilty, you would be in jail or suffering some other penalty for being a witch. But typically people who confessed the witchcraft were just used to extract further names. They weren't necessarily executed in Salem, which is different from the continent again. So Giles Corey refuses to enter any plea at all. And at this point, something really gruesome happens to him. The record says he was pressed to death by stones. Now, I'm a confirmed history nerd with a less than healthy interest in some of the gruesome ways that people have been put to death over the course of human history, but I wasn't familiar with this particular method. So let me explain. This comes from England and the English legal system, where if someone was accused of a capital offense, it didn't matter if they pleaded guilty or innocent. If they were found by the court to be guilty, then they would be executed and all of their property would go to the crown. In other words, their wife, children, other family members would be left with nothing. Now, in societies that have no social safety net, this can be a grim and absolutely destructive situation. You could have people absolutely penniless on the street dying of starvation. And so the only way to avoid this possibility was not to enter a plea at all. So if you refused to open your mouth to respond to the charges that were leveled against you, and you would not say if you were innocent or guilty, then even if they executed you, your property would still go to your family. So now Giles Corey, even though he's not in England, he's in New England, is now in exactly the same situation. Having seen the way the witch trials are going, he knows that even if he says he's innocent, as his wife Martha Corey did, he's likely to be hanged. And that means he loses everything. His property is gone. Any children he has will inherit nothing. So instead, Giles Corey chooses the other road. He chooses silence. At this point, he's going to suffer this fate of being pressed to death by stones. So typically, when this was done, the accused person would be taken to a prison cell, although sometimes it was done outside. They would be stripped naked. They would have ropes attached to each arm and leg to stretch them out. And then a board or a platform of some kind would be placed over their torso. And on this platform, weights would be stacked. The idea of being pressed in this way was that the gradual adding of more and more weight that would press down on the victim's torso and cause them enormous amounts of pain and being unable to breathe and possibly break their ribs, the idea was to break your will to be silent. And so you could end being pressed to death if you would only utter your plea. If you would only say, make it stop, and agree to plead either innocent or guilty, the ordeal could end. But of course, then you'd be back in the original situation of leaving your family nothing. So this is what happens to Giles Corey. He's taken out to a field, he's stripped, a platform is put on him, and weight is piled on. Some records of this gruesome ordeal involve weights up to 700 or 800 pounds being placed on a human body. So you would either speak or you'd be crushed to death. And this is what happened to Giles Corey. He remained silent except to say only more weight. And they would continually add weights until he eventually died. This gruesome punishment of being pressed to death by stones formally existed in the English legal code until 1772, almost 100 years after it was done to Giles Corey in New England. But if you think for a moment about Giles Corey and about his wife Martha Corey, you have to admire the resolution of spirit that both of them showed. Martha refused to admit her guilt, even though she was going to die for it. If she had cooperated with the court, if she had invented some story about her cooperation with the devil, as many other people did, she probably would have survived. She would have been in jail, perhaps for months, possibly years. She would eventually have been released and been socially ostracized, but she would probably have lived. It would have cost her, though, her integrity, and also she would have had to incriminate other people in the course of her confession. She chose death rather than this. And her husband, an even grimmer fate, something far more prolonged and far more painful. The pressing to death with stones could last for days. He wasn't a young man either. Some records say that he was probably over 60. And yet he was willing to stand against the will of everybody else in the community to believe these charges of witchcraft or to cooperate in legitimizing a process that was ripping the community apart. The fate suffered by Martha Corey and Giles Corey only served to fuel the flames of panic in Salem Village. Because now anyone who was the victim of a grudge that someone else in the community had against them was liable to end up accused of witchcraft. Anyone who might be involved in a property dispute might find that a relative of someone on the other side of that dispute had accused them of witchcraft. Anyone who dared to voice any doubt about the credibility of the girls making the accusations or about the innocence of some of the people who had been accused was very likely to be next. And if you had the misfortune of being related to someone who was accused, you yourself were very likely to end up in the witness box. And so we see a cascade of panic beginning. And sometimes it ends up with people in the same family accusing each other to try and protect themselves. And one story that illustrates this perfectly is the story of Mary Lacey. Mary Lacey's grandmother, an elderly woman, 72 years old, named Anne Foster, was first accused of witchcraft. She was, of course, pressed for details on who else she had collaborated with and whether any other members of her family were involved. She denied that anyone related to her was involved in witchcraft, but she confessed interactions with the devil and magical acts and harming other people, which put her in jail. Then her middle-aged daughter, Mary Lacey, was accused. And while Her mother had said that Mary was not involved. In her own confession, Mary said, yes, my mother Anne recruited me for the devil. We have together attended the witches' Sabbaths many times, and so on. It would seem bizarre to you and I that a 40-year-old woman would accuse her elderly mother of witchcraft, but her calculation was probably that her mother had already been accused. Therefore, she could not be harmed further by her daughter's testimony, and perhaps by directing an accusation at her mother who had already been tarnished with it, she was avoiding pointing the finger at someone else who hadn't already been dragged in. Unfortunately, she didn't succeed, because the next person who was accused of witchcraft and dragged in was 40-year-old daughter Mary's 17-year-old daughter, Mary Lacy Jr. Mary Lacy was dragged in, and as the granddaughter of one witch and the daughter of another witch, she was certainly thought of as a witch without any doubt. And so she initially refused to testify, but then she was told this was the only way that she could save her soul and to escape death. And so eventually she also supplied a testimony that accused both her mother and her grandmother, simply providing verification to the picture that the inquisitors had already formed. And this is exactly what we see happening again and again in Salem. It mirrors what we saw last episode on the continent, where inquisitors would come with a fixed list of questions that reflected a picture of witchcraft that they already had in their minds. They would then extract confessions from people to confirm this fixed picture. And they would use these confessions and the sameness of answers that they got, usually by pressure and torture, to prove that the picture of witchcraft they had already constructed was correct. We see teenage boys in Salem being tortured and beaten into accusing their own mother. Family members, neighbors, relatives, the circle just goes on. And there are so many different points of pressure that can be applied to a person that to escape is very difficult. And only a few individualists like Martha Corey and Giles Corey were successful in resisting the overwhelming pressure to lend your voice to confirm the credibility of what was going on in the hope of saving yourself from an untimely death. It's hard to imagine living in Salem Village at this time and being caught up in this tidal wave of panic. And in many ways, it was so powerful because it accessed a strong existing reserve of fear. Fear of violence, fear of the devil, fear of being under attack. And now, finally, all these fears of sort of unseen dangers lurking at the edges of the villages, whether it was shadowy figures going along the tree line at night who might massacre you and your family in your sleep, to the more invisible forces of Satan that could lurk anywhere, trying to ruin your life and take your soul. Now, finally, these things had taken on flesh, and they were your neighbors, and they were your sister, and they were the people in the minister's own household. They might be your maid. It was impossible to know who next would turn and go from being a trusted and friendly member of the community to being someone who was either a servant of the devil or someone who had accused you or someone you knew of being a servant of the devil. So the amount of terror would have been amazing, and people would be doing just about anything they could to try and protect themselves and their loved ones from this. In the end, it spread outside of Salem Village. It began to go to neighboring towns and villages, and it was an unprecedented scale of an outbreak of witchcraft in the New World. Nothing like it had been seen before. There had been isolated cases, but this sort of explosion of neighbor against neighbor and family member against family member, children against their parents and husbands against wives, was unheard of, as were the number of people who began to pile up in jail and the number of bodies hanging from trees that began to go up at monthly intervals as these courts sentenced accused witches throughout the summer of 1692. In our next episode, we're going to get into some of the reasons why this panic finally died down and some of the lessons that the Salem witch craze still has for us. Because while the idea of a witch may have faded, the mechanisms that were involved in creating this kind of a panic and hysteria are very much alive and well with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it and share it with someone else you think would also appreciate it. I'll see you in the next episode.